9 alien warships dropped out of the dark and opened fire on a human convoy without a single hail, without a single warning shot across the bow, without so much as the courtesy of a demand for surrender that even the ugliest wars usually still bothered to offer. And the convoy died exactly the way it was designed to, in a silent, spectacular cascade of fire that lit up 40 kilometers of empty space like a funeral pyre with nobody left inside it to mourn. Commander Naomi Villanueva watched the entire engagement unfold on the tactical display aboard the intelligence relay station Quiet Harbor, 3 light minutes away, close enough to receive real-time sensor data, far enough to remain completely invisible to the 9 ships currently reducing 11 cargo haulers to expanding fields of debris. She watched the lead alien vessel's weapons batteries fire in disciplined, methodical volleys, watched each hauler's hull rupture and vent atmosphere, and finally break apart under sustained fire that seemed, to any outside observer without her specific knowledge, like exactly the kind of merciless, overwhelming force a hostile power might use to make an example of a defenseless target. She watched, and she felt nothing resembling the horror that report would eventually generate across a dozen frightened news channels back on Earth. Because Naomi Villanueva knew something the 9 attacking ships did not yet know. Something that made the entire, terrible spectacle unfolding on her display feel less like a massacre, and more like the closing of a very carefully baited trap. Every one of those 11 cargo haulers had been empty. No crew, no cargo. Not one living soul aboard any of them, and hadn't been for the entire duration of their carefully staged, carefully timed passage through the Corvath threshold. The narrow, contested stretch of neutral space that had, for the past 6 months, marked the fragile, uneasy boundary between human territory and the outer holdings of the Virean Dominion. An ancient, honor-bound alien civilization that humanity had fought a brutal, costly war against 11 years earlier. And had spent the 6 years since carefully, painstakingly rebuilding into something that almost, on its best days, resembled peace. "Confirm final tally," Naomi said, her voice steady despite the churn of adrenaline she was working hard not to let show. "I want exact numbers on their firing pattern before this data gets even 1 minute older." Her intelligence analyst, a meticulous, soft-spoken lieutenant named Priya Okonkwares, who had transferred to the Quiet Harbor 8 months earlier specifically because her instructors had flagged her as possessing the kind of pattern recognition intuition that couldn't be taught, was already pulling apart the sensor logs with quick, precise motions. 9 vessels, Commander. The class matches the Dominion's Thresvane pattern strike cruisers, but here's the thing, that's not a standard Dominion patrol configuration. Standard doctrine calls for a minimum escort of 2 support vessels alongside any strike group that size. These 9 came alone, no logistics support, no communication relay ship, nothing that would normally accompany an authorized Dominion military action of this scale. "Which means," Naomi said slowly, working through the implication with the same careful, deliberate patience she'd built her entire intelligence career on, either the Dominion's Central Command authorized an unusually lean, unusually deniable strike force for this specific operation, or these 9 ships aren't operating under Central Command authorization at all. "That's my read too," Priya said. "And there's something else, Commander. Their firing pattern, it's disciplined, it's thorough. They made absolutely certain every hauler was reduced past any possibility of salvage or forensic recovery. That's not the behavior of a force that stumbled onto an unexpected target and panicked into overkill. That's the behavior of a force that came here specifically to destroy something completely, and wanted to make certain nothing survived that could later prove what actually happened here." Naomi allowed herself a slow, careful breath, watching the tactical display as the 9 alien warships, their work apparently finished, began a slow, unhurried withdrawal back toward Dominion territory, moving with the kind of unbothered confidence of a force that fully expected to face no consequences whatsoever for what they had just done. They had no idea, yet, that they had just walked directly into the single most important intelligence operation. The human assembly had run against the Virean Dominion since the war ended 6 years ago. If you're already wondering what those convoys were actually carrying instead of crew and cargo, and why someone would risk staging an attack this elaborate just to prove a point, you're asking exactly the right question. And if you want to see how deep this rabbit hole actually goes, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because Commander Villanueva's investigation from here is going to unravel something far more dangerous than a single rogue strike force. Let me know in the comments what you think humanity should do once they find out who really gave that order. Now, back to the dark. The convoy operation had begun 4 months earlier. Born out of a problem Naomi had spent the better part of a year trying to solve without ever quite being able to prove it existed. Human merchant vessels transiting the Korvath threshold, the single narrow, treaty-protected corridor that allowed limited, carefully regulated trade between human and Dominion territory in the uneasy years since the war, had been disappearing at a rate that defied simple coincidence. Not often. Not so frequently that any single loss couldn't be explained away by the ordinary hazards of deep space travel. A navigational hazard, a mechanical failure, the kind of rare but unremarkable tragedy that happened to any species crossing dangerous, poorly charted space. But cumulatively, over the 18 months preceding Naomi's investigation, the pattern had become impossible for her analytical instincts to ignore. 7 vessels lost, all along the same general transit corridor, all carrying cargo of at least moderate value, all vanishing without a single distress signal or debris field ever recovered. The official Dominion position, delivered through their diplomatic liaison office with what Naomi had always found to be genuine, carefully documented cooperation, was that they had no knowledge of any hostile action against human vessels transiting the threshold, and that their own patrol logs showed no unusual activity in the region during any of the 7 disappearances. Naomi had believed that position mostly for the better part of a year, not because she was naive about the possibility of Dominion deception, but because everything she knew about Dominion military culture suggested that outright, deniable violence against a treaty partner, conducted covertly and without any accompanying diplomatic pressure or demand, simply didn't fit the honor-bound, formally structured way the Dominion's Central Command typically operated. Which meant, if her instincts were right, that something considerably more complicated than simple treaty violation was happening in that corridor. And the only way to prove it, without provoking a full diplomatic crisis based on unconfirmed suspicion, was to bait the trap herself, carefully, deniably, and wait to see exactly who took it. The convoy needs to look completely real, Naomi had told her small planning team 4 months before the ambush that was now unfolding on her tactical display. Not just empty ships running on automated pilot. I want full manifest documentation, real trade route filings through legitimate merchant channels, cargo transponder signatures that would pass any routine inspection. If anyone is watching that corridor closely enough to selectively target valuable human shipments, I want them to have absolutely no way of telling this convoy apart from a genuine one, right up until the moment they've already committed to attacking it. It had taken considerable political capital, and no small amount of careful, deniable maneuvering through assembly logistics channels, to construct 11 decommissioned cargo haulers into a convoy convincing enough to pass as a genuine high-value merchant shipment. And Naomi had spent every one of the intervening 4 months bracing herself for the very real possibility that her theory was wrong, that the 7 prior disappearances really were nothing more than the ordinary tragic hazards of deep space travel, and that she would have spent an enormous amount of resources and political goodwill proving absolutely nothing. Instead, 9 unmarked Dominion strike cruisers had just spent several disciplined, methodical minutes annihilating her decoy convoy with a thoroughness that told her, with near total certainty, that she had just confirmed everything she'd suspected and uncovered a mystery considerably larger and more dangerous than the simple confirmation she'd been hoping for. "I need everything you can pull on those 9 ships before they clear our sensor range," Naomi told Priya. "Hull registry numbers, any identifiable crew communication chatter, anything at all that tells us whether this was authorized by Dominion Central Command, or whether we're looking at something operating entirely outside their official chain of authority." It took Priya nearly 6 hours of painstaking analysis, cross-referencing every fragment of intercepted communication chatter against the Quiet Harbor's extensive archive of known Dominion military signatures, before she returned to Naomi's office with an expression that suggested the answer was both exactly what they'd hoped for and considerably more complicated than either of them had unpacked. "I found a partial hull registry match," Priya said, pulling up a comparison display. "The lead vessel, the one coordinating the strike formation, matches a Threshvane pattern cruiser previously assigned to a Dominion border defense flotilla under the command of a fleet marshal named Korathis Venadar. And Commander, here's where it gets complicated. Fleet Marshal Venadar isn't some rogue officer operating outside the chain of command. He's a genuinely senior, genuinely respected figure within the Dominion's military hierarchy, decorated during the war, currently serving on the Dominion's own Internal Defense Council. If he authorized this strike, it wasn't some deniable black operation cooked up by a handful of resentful junior officers. It potentially reaches into the actual leadership structure of the Dominion's military establishment." Naomi felt the shape of the problem sharpen considerably, the comfortable, containable version of the mystery she'd hoped to find, a handful of rogue officers acting without authorization. A problem the Dominion's own legitimate leadership would be eager to help resolve quietly, collapsing into something far more dangerous. A mystery that potentially implicated the very peace process both governments had spent 6 painstaking years building, from someone with genuine standing and genuine influence within the Dominion's own command structure. "We need to be extraordinarily careful about how we handle this," Naomi said slowly. "If Fleet Marshal Venadar really is behind these attacks, and we take this information straight to formal diplomatic channels, we risk 2 equally bad outcomes. Either the Dominion's central government already knows about this and has been quietly tolerating it, in which case a formal accusation triggers exactly the kind of diplomatic crisis that could unravel the entire treaty, or the Dominion's central government genuinely doesn't know, in which case we've just handed a powerful, well-connected internal faction advance warning that we're onto them, before we understand how deep their support actually runs, or what they're planning to do next." "So what's the play?" Priya asked. "The play," Naomi said, "is that I have a contact within the Dominion's diplomatic office who I trust more than I trust most humans I've worked with. Ambassador Liaison Threll Kivos-Ran. She was part of the original treaty negotiation team 6 years ago, and in every interaction I've had with her since, she's struck me as someone who takes the peace we built genuinely, personally seriously, not as a political convenience, but as something she actually believes matters. I want to bring this to her directly, privately, before it becomes an official assembly matter, and give her the chance to help us understand what we're actually looking at before either government has to respond formally to something neither of us fully understands yet." Ambassador Liaison Threll Kivos-Ran met Naomi 3 days later, aboard a small, deliberately unremarkable neutral territory transit station specifically chosen because its limited surveillance infrastructure made it exactly the kind of place 2 people could have an off-the-record conversation without either government's more paranoid factions immediately learning about it. Kivos-Ran was tall even by Virean standards, her species' distinctive dual-lidded eyes carrying an expression Naomi had learned, across 6 years of careful diplomatic contact, to read as genuine concern rather than the ritualized formal courtesy the Dominion's more senior officials often defaulted to in less trusted company. "You would not have requested this meeting through unofficial channels," Kivosran said, once the pleasantries required by Virean custom had been properly observed. Unless you believe the information you're carrying was dangerous enough to damage the treaty if handled incorrectly. I would ask you to trust me enough to tell me plainly what you found, Commander Villanueva, rather than easing into it the way your species' diplomatic culture often prefers. 6 years of working together has taught me that you and I communicate more efficiently when we skip the careful preamble. Naomi allowed herself a small, genuine smile despite the gravity of what she was about to share. One of the things she had always appreciated most about Kivosran was exactly this directness, a quality that had made their working relationship, across the careful, difficult years of the post-war treaty period, considerably easier than many of her interactions with her own government's more cautious diplomatic staff. 4 months ago, Naomi said, I authorized a covert operation to identify who has been responsible for the disappearance of 7 human merchant vessels along the Corvath threshold over the past 18 months. 3 days ago, that operation confirmed my suspicion. 9 unmarked Threshvane pattern strike cruisers attacked in. D completely destroyed what they believed to be a genuine, high-value human convoy. The convoy was empty, a deliberate decoy, staged specifically to draw out whoever has been responsible for the prior disappearances. And preliminary hull registry analysis suggests the lead vessel in that strike formation was previously assigned to a border defense flotilla under the command of Fleet Marshal Korathis Venadar. Kivosran's dual-lidded eyes narrowed slightly, an expression Naomi recognized from years of careful study as the Virean equivalent of genuine serious alarm carefully controlled beneath diplomatic composure. That is a significant accusation, Commander Villanueva. Fleet Marshal Venadar sits on the Dominion's Internal Defense Council. If your registry match is accurate, this is not a matter of rogue border patrol officers acting outside their authority. This reaches considerably higher into our military establishment than either of us would prefer. I know, Naomi said, which is exactly why I brought this to you privately, before it becomes an official assembly matter. Rather than filing a formal diplomatic protest that could trigger a crisis neither of our governments is prepared to manage if it turns out this reaches deeper than either of us currently understands. I need to know, honestly, whether you believe your own central government is aware of what Venadar may have been doing, or whether this is something he's been running independently, using his position and his personal command authority to conduct operations outside official sanction. Kivosran was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight Naomi had rarely heard from her across 6 years of careful diplomatic partnership. I do not believe the Central Council authorized this, she said. I want to be honest with you, Commander Villanueva, in a way my formal diplomatic role does not always permit. There has been considerable internal tension within our military leadership since the treaty's ratification. Fleet Marshal Venadar was among the most vocal opponents of the peace terms 6 years ago. He argued publicly and repeatedly that the Dominion's honor required continued resistance rather than what he characterized as capitulation to a species we had, in his assessment, nearly defeated before political weakness within our own leadership chose surrender instead of victory. He was outvoted formally by the Council's majority. But a formal vote does not always end a genuine ideological conviction, and I fear, based on everything you've just told me, that he may have spent the past 6 years quietly building the capability to undermine a peace he never actually accepted. If that's true, Naomi said carefully, then we're not looking at a simple rogue commander acting alone. We're looking at someone with genuine institutional standing, genuine resources, and apparently genuine patience, who's been working for years to manufacture exactly the kind of incident that could collapse the treaty entirely. And he just destroyed what he believed was a real human convoy, with real casualties, specifically to provoke exactly that kind of collapse. Yes, Kivosran said quietly. And I fear, Commander Villanueva, that if this becomes public before we can address it carefully on both sides, It will accomplish exactly what Venadar intended regardless of whether he is ever formally held accountable for it. Your own government's more hostile factions will demand retaliation for what they will reasonably believe to be an unprovoked massacre. Our own more hostile factions will use any resulting retaliation to argue that Venadar was right all along, that peace with humanity was never genuinely possible, and that the 6 years we have spent building this treaty were nothing but a temporary weakness before an inevitable return to war. We are, both of us, standing at the edge of exactly the outcome Venadar has apparently been working toward for years, and the only path I can see that avoids it requires both of our governments to handle this with a level of restraint and coordination that frankly terrifies me to ask for, given how fragile the trust between our peoples still is. Naomi thought about the empty convoy, 11 decommissioned haulers reduced to debris by 9 ships whose commander believed, with total confidence, that he had just killed hundreds of human crew members and dealt a significant blow to human merchant shipping, and felt a grim, complicated relief settle alongside the weight of everything Virean had just told her. Whatever else this crisis represented, at least the actual, immediate human cost of Venadar's attack had been zero, a fact that bought them time and options a genuine massacre never would have allowed. He doesn't know the convoy was empty, Naomi said slowly, an idea beginning to form. As far as Venadar and his people are concerned, they just suck. Successfully destroyed a real human convoy and killed everyone aboard. That gives us something valuable, time, and the element of surprise, because he has no idea we're already onto him, and no idea that his attack didn't actually produce the outcome he's expecting to use as justification for whatever comes next. "What are you proposing?" Virean asked. "I'm proposing," Naomi said, "that instead of letting this become a public crisis that plays directly into Venadar's hands, we use the time his own miscalculation has bought us to build an airtight case, presented jointly by both our governments, before he has any chance to control the narrative himself. If your Central Council receives clear, undeniable evidence that one of their own senior military officials has been conducting years of covert violence against a treaty partner specifically to sabotage the peace process, and that evidence comes packaged with a clear demonstration that human intelligence services already understood the situation well enough to prevent actual casualties through careful planning rather than panicked retaliation. That's a very different story than a simple accusation of Dominion aggression. That's a story about two governments working together to protect a peace that a rogue faction within one of them tried to destroy." Virean considered this for a long moment, her expression carrying the particular weight of someone calculating both the enormous risk and the genuine hard-won opportunity embedded in what Naomi was proposing. "It is a considerable gamble," she said finally. "If Venadar has more support within the council than I currently believe he does, presenting this evidence could trigger exactly the crisis we're trying to avoid rather than preventing it. But I confess, Commander Villanueva, that the alternative, allowing this to fester in silence, allowing Venadar to continue building whatever capability he has apparently been building for years, waiting for an attack that produces genuine casualties rather than empty cargo haulers, frightens me considerably more. I will bring this to Council Elder Ithara Senoscal, the senior member of our Defense Council, who I believe remains most genuinely committed to the treaty's continuation. She has the standing to move against Venadar if the evidence is sufficient, and I trust her discretion more than I trust almost anyone else currently serving in our government." It took another 11 days of careful, methodical, painstakingly coordinated work, Naomi's team compiling every fragment of intercepted communication data, hull registry analysis, and pattern documentation from the 7 prior vessel disappearances into a case detailed and rigorous enough to withstand the scrutiny Virean warned her it would inevitably face, while Virean herself worked, quietly and at considerable personal risk, to secure a private audience with Council Elder Senoscal before news of the destroyed convoy could spread through official channels, and force a public response neither side was prepared to manage. Before the fragile, carefully constructed plan finally reached the moment Naomi had been simultaneously hoping for and dreading since the ambush first unfolded on her tactical display. Council Elder Ithara Senoscal requested a formal but strictly limited meeting, conducted through secure, heavily encrypted diplomatic channels, attended only by herself, Virean, Naomi, and a small handful of trusted staff from each side. Naomi had expected, walking into that meeting, to face considerable skepticism, perhaps even hostility, from a senior Dominion official being asked to believe that one of her own most decorated, most respected colleagues had spent years secretly working to sabotage a peace the entire council had formally approved. What she found instead, in Senoscal's careful, measured questions and the genuine, visible distress that crossed her features as the full case unfolded, was something closer to the same grim, complicated relief Naomi herself had felt upon learning the convoy's destruction hadn't actually cost a single life. "I had suspicions," Senoscal admitted once the full presentation concluded, her voice carrying the weight of someone confronting a betrayal she had feared but never allowed herself to fully believe. Venadar has grown increasingly withdrawn from council deliberations over the past 2 years, increasingly private about his flotilla's activities, increasingly difficult to reach through ordinary command channels for extended periods. I told myself these were the ordinary eccentricities of a proud, aging officer struggling to accept a peace he had never personally embraced. I did not want to believe he would act on that resistance so directly, so dangerously, against my own counsel's explicit decision. She looked at Naomi directly, her dual-lidded eyes carrying an expression that needed no translation software to convey its. "Wait, you could have brought this to my government publicly, Commander Villanueva. You could have demanded accountability through formal diplomatic channels, backed by the full moral authority of an unprovoked attack on your people's shipping. Your government would have had every right to do so, and considerable political incentive as well. Why did you choose this path instead?" "Because," Naomi said, "I've spent 6 years watching both our governments work incredibly hard to build something genuinely fragile and genuinely valuable out of the wreckage of a war neither of our peoples wanted to fight again. I don't think Fleet Marshal Venadar represents the Virean Dominion any more than I'd want a single, dangerously misguided human official to be allowed to represent the entirety of humanity's intentions toward your people. This isn't about assigning blame to your entire government for the actions of one man who apparently never accepted his own council's decision. It's about making sure that man doesn't get to succeed in destroying something the rest of us have worked too hard to build." Senoscal was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried something that Virean, watching from beside her, would later tell Naomi she had rarely heard the council elder express so openly. "Then I will act on this evidence swiftly, and I will act on it in a manner that makes clear both to my own government and to yours that the Dominion's central leadership does not tolerate this kind of covert sabotage against a peace we entered freely and continue to value. Fleet Marshal Venadar will be removed from his command and from his council position, effective immediately, and will face formal judgment before our full council for actions taken entirely outside his legitimate authority. I will also ensure that full compensation and acknowledgement is offered to the families of the 7 vessels lost prior to your decoy operation, and that the truth of what actually happened to the convoy your people staged is disclosed honestly, rather than allowed to fester as an unresolved mystery that could be exploited by anyone seeking to reignite hostility between our peoples. The removal of Fleet Marshal Corathas Venadar and the formal, carefully coordinated joint disclosure that followed 3 weeks later, a disclosure that Naomi and Virean had spent considerable additional effort crafting together, ensuring both governments' official statements aligned precisely enough that neither side's more hostile factions could easily exploit any perceived inconsistency between them, did not entirely eliminate the tension that had built quietly. throughout the Dominion's military establishment during the 6 uneasy years since the war's end. Naomi understood from her careful debriefings with Kivos-Ran in the months that followed that Venedar had indeed built a genuine, if ultimately unsuccessful, faction of support among certain hardline elements within the Dominion's officer corps, and that his removal, however necessary, had not been universally celebrated within every corner of that establishment. But it had also not triggered the crisis either woman had feared. The Dominion's Central Council, faced with clear, carefully documented evidence of one senior official's covert betrayal of an official peace, had chosen accountability and transparency over the kind of institutional self-protection that might have buried the entire matter and allowed Venedar's faction to continue operating in the shadows. And humanity's own government, presented with a case built not around inflammatory accusation, but around careful, coordinated joint disclosure, had responded with measured relief rather than the kind of retaliatory panic that had, Naomi knew from long, careful study of the war's original outbreak 11 years earlier, so often proven the actual spark that turned manageable tension into catastrophic conflict. Naomi met with Kivos-Ran one final time 6 months after the ambush, aboard the same small, unremarkable transit station where their private conversation had first begun, and found herself, in the quiet aftermath of a crisis both of them had somehow managed to prevent from becoming a war, reflecting on exactly how narrow that margin had actually been. "I keep thinking about how differently this could have gone," Naomi admitted. "If that convoy had been real, if we'd lost actual crew, actual lives to Venedar's attack, I don't know if either of our governments would have had the patience or the trust to handle the aftermath the way we managed to handle it. I think we would have been at war within weeks." "I have thought the same thing many times in the months since," Kivos-Ran admitted. "It is a strange, uncomfortable thing, Commander Villanueva, to owe the survival of a fragile peace to the fact that a decoy convoy happened to be empty rather than full. I do not think either of our governments should take too much comfort from how narrowly we avoided catastrophe this time. The next test, whenever it comes, may not offer us the same margin for careful, patient response." "No," Naomi agreed, "it probably won't, but I think what actually saved us wasn't the empty convoy exactly. It was that you and I had spent 6 years building enough trust between us, personally, professionally, that when the crisis finally came, we had somewhere solid enough to stand while we figured out how to handle it together. The convoy just bought us time. What we did with that time, that's the part that actually mattered." Kivos-Ran's dual-lidded eyes held something that Naomi, after 6 years of careful, patient study, had finally learned to recognize as genuine warmth beneath her species' formal diplomatic composure. "Then perhaps," she said, "the true lesson of this entire affair is not simply that Fleet Marshal Venedar failed in his attempt to destroy our peace, but that the peace itself proved considerably stronger than either of us, 6 years ago, would have dared to hope it might become. Strong enough to survive a genuine, deliberate act of betrayal from within its own institutions, and to emerge from that betrayal not weakened, but tested, and having passed that test, perhaps a little more resilient than it was before." Naomi thought about the 11 empty haulers, reduced to drifting debris in the cold, silent expanse of the Korvath threshold. A spectacular, terrible display of violence that had in the end cost nothing but decommissioned hardware, and had instead exposed the exact fracture line that both governments needed to see and address before it grew wide enough to swallow the peace whole. She thought about Commander Alice Renner's old, careful principle, one Naomi had encountered years earlier during her own intelligence training, studying the archived case files of humanity's difficult, hard-won early diplomatic history, that the measure of any peace was found not in whether it was ever tested, because every peace eventually would be tested by someone unwilling to accept it, but in whether the people responsible for protecting it had the wisdom and the patience to meet that test with something better than fear. The Korvath threshold reopened to regular merchant traffic 4 months later, its narrow, treaty-protected corridor once again carrying genuine cargo between human and Dominion territory. And Naomi made a point, whenever her duties allowed, of tracking the safe, uneventful transit of every convoy that passed through it. Real convoys now, real crews, real cargo, moving through space that had once nearly become the spark of a second devastating war, now carrying instead the quiet, unremarkable, ordinary business of two civilizations who had chosen, in the moment it mattered most, to trust each other enough to find the truth together rather than let a rogue commander's calculated betrayal decide their future for them. Somewhere in the vast, patient dark beyond the threshold, Naomi understood other tests were surely still coming. Other factions, other grievances, other calculated provocations designed to unravel a peace that remained, 6 years after its founding, considerably more fragile than either government's public optimism liked to admit. But for now, in the quiet, uneventful hum of merchant convoys passing safely through space that had so nearly become a battlefield, she found something that felt, cautiously and carefully, like genuine hope. The recognition that a peace built on patient trust, tested by fire and found against every reasonable fear to hold, was a peace worth every difficult, careful year it had taken to build, and every difficult, careful year it would still take to protect.